Okay. So, first of all, I guess just as a introduction for how I met Rick or how I came across Rick, I do a little podcast, the Explorer Poet podcast. And I just find people who I think are talking about interesting things online, who are posting interesting things. And as you know, Rick's been working with men, kind of doing men's work. And I'll let him dive into that a little bit more. But yeah, I met Rick or I came across his work online and I was impressed with some of the things that he was sharing. And so I reached out and we had a conversation almost, I would say it's about a year or just over a year ago that we first spoke and talked a lot about personal stories and how they affect us as we grow and as we try to mature and kind of the way that stories can capture us. And then we need to kind of circle back around and make sure that we're the ones in control. But for me, for anybody who's listened to my podcast or ever met up with my meetup groups, we just I love talking about stories. And in particular, I talk a lot from a Jungian psychology or psychoanalytic perspective. So a lot of Jungian archetypes, a lot of Jungian psychology as far as an architecture for understanding the human psyche with the unconscious and the conscious, and then just diving a lot into symbols and and so for me the stuff that Rick talks about, it really hits home and I can see it kind of like I have a lot of personal experience with it in my own life from a practical perspective, living through some things and then having to work through them. But also, I'm also just fascinated by the story side of it and kind of the internal kind of psyche side of it and how we go through these processes of realizing the stories that we've told ourselves and then working our way back from them. So, Rick, I wanted to give you a minute also and just talk a little bit about what it is you do and kind of, what is your practice and how do you work with people in this regard?
Okay, Josh, thanks for getting this discussion together. I think it's going to be a good one. I am a men's coach, and I work with people internationally over Zoom. So all my work is remote, which is great because I get to contact people from all over the place and they can find me and we can work together. My primary demographic, my primary working audience is men. About 90% of my clients are men, maybe 85%, the other 10 to 15% are women. I am primarily oriented toward working with men because that's what I know best from my own experience and my own research and all my observation over the years. Um, I've been involved in the arena of men's work since about 1987, however many years that is. And I started out writing. I was writing poetry. I wrote 3 poetry books about at various stages about my experience uh, as a man, as it was an expression of my experience as a child in a lot of ways. Um, and uh, and I was in a lot of men's groups. I had the great opportunity to work with a lot of some of the men in the late 80s who were starting to lead some of these workshops and groups and so forth. So I had in mind for a long time to coach and to work with men directly. And I finally got that off the ground about 7 years ago. And so the sorts of things that I'm interested in with men in particular is as an entry point is men who are feeling stuck. You might be feeling stuck in your relationship, in your marriage. You might be feeling stuck financially. You might be feeling stuck in your work, or everything else might be fine and you still feel stuck. And that's an opportunity for you to work with somebody like me and begin to develop a better understanding of what's actually happening under the covers that's leading to that situation of either feeling or being stuck. Um, there are a number of issues that I highlight with men. We're going to get into that a little bit. But the thing I always tell every man is that the most important thing I want to help him with is his relationship with himself. That was the thing I didn't know when I was 28 or 29 years old and I first started getting involved in this kind of work as a participant. I thought, well, I hate my job. I can't keep a girlfriend. All my friends are getting married and I'm alone. And I thought if I could solve those problems, then that would solve all the problems that I have. And what I didn't realize is the biggest problem I had is I had a rotten relationship with myself. And so that's something that I don't necessarily talk about explicitly with every man in every coaching session, but that's something that runs under the surface. And it goes to what Josh was talking about at the beginning, the stories, the narratives that we carry around, and this will go to something we're going to talk about in a little bit, the narratives and the stories and the belief systems that we construct as children, which unfortunately we tend to carry well into adulthood. Some people carry them their whole lives, they don't even know it. So it's really essential and really beneficial and really productive as you get into a more thoughtful, aware relationship with yourself to understand what kind of stories you're telling yourself all the time, because we live in the stories we tell ourselves. We spend far more time in the stories we tell ourselves than we do in the outside world, in a lot of cases. And so I guess that's a sort of best little thumbnail description that I can come up with at the moment, Josh.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. And the idea of stories, just to kind of hone in on that, that idea that we live our lives based on these stories until the stories, they don't support our lives in the way we expected. Just as an example, I guess I would throw out the even the stories that you shared, right? Like the story of getting married and becoming a father, having a family, the story of getting an education, getting a job and moving up, whatever your career is, the story of, your religion, the story of your family. So these stories come about through the environment that we're raised in. So a big part of it is family, a big part of it is country, a big part of it is religion. And yeah, to me, it's just really important to be able to dive into those stories. Um, I guess maybe as a first question for you, Rick, as you talk about getting in touch or connecting with yourself, like having a relationship with yourself. How does it? How would you say it happens that along our story we somehow disconnect from ourselves, or we somehow hurt or harm that relationship with ourselves?
Well, in a lot of cases, it's a matter of survival. If you're a child who's growing up in a less than optimal family system, there are going to be parts of you that are not welcome in that system or that don't make sense to the other people. That's kind of like the best case. The worst case is you're in a family system where there's overt neglect, there's trauma, there's abuse, and you learn that if you show certain parts of yourself in that family system, that you will be threatened, you will be hurt, you will be damaged in some way, you will be rejected, you'll be excluded, you'll be made fun of, you'll be shamed, all those different things. So it's natural from a survival standpoint for us as the kind of manager of ourselves as little kids to come to the conclusion, well, this part of me is not welcome. This part of me is not safe. This part of me brings bad things down on me. So I'm going to push it in the back. I'm going to make it invisible. I'm going to forget about it. Um, and every time you do that, a little fragment of yourself just kind of goes off somewhere. And by the time you're 18 years old, you're going out in the world, you might only be 50% of the person that you are in your essence, because you've learned that the other 50% doesn't serve you to get to the point where you're an adult. And then you become an adult and you do all the things and you think you're doing it right. And you reach a certain point and you're going, I don't feel like I'm all here. And that's the opportunity to retrieve those things and start to defragment yourself so that you're actually closer to being the whole person that you started out with the capability to be.
That's right. Yeah, from a story perspective, the one that always stands out to me, because we're talking about children growing up, is Peter Pan. And
Mhm.
if I look at all the characters as symbolic or archetypical, and so if you look at Captain Hook, who became a tyrant as an adult, what did he have to do to become that tyrant? He had to cut off a part of his hand. That's what made him. That's the part of his childhood that he left behind, right? That's
Mhm.
the Peter Pan part of himself, because it was Peter Pan that took that part of him, right? It was an inability to integrate that childhood part of himself because some part of the environment was forcing him towards tyranny. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. So then, I'm sure that you have a lot of different ways for getting to kind of this idea of separation from self, or having a poor relationship with self. But is there a place you like? Is there a place to focus or to start from the very beginning as the source of that separation?
Well, there's a number of things. One of the things that I've learned to do that I encourage people to do is to become conscious of the way that you talk to yourself internally, you know, and also not just the words, but the feelings that you carry around inside yourself. The more conscious you are of the messages, like, you're maybe you're a little bit slower than somebody else to maybe, so you start a new job. And I had this happened to me on every job. It didn't matter how successful I was in the previous job. First 3 weeks on a new job, I felt like the stupidest man on earth, you know? And like that wasn't true. I just needed some time to get started and to learn the environment and do a little learning curve and all that kind of stuff. But because of the sort of experiences I had as a child, where I was told I was stupid, or you'll never learn, or you'll never get it, or someone would walk away from me because I wasn't learning fast enough, that sort of messaging and those feelings of just those horrible feelings of I'm stupid, I'm ashamed of myself, I'm going to get fired. So that's the first step. And then the next step is to start to trace it back and go, okay, where did that start? Right? Who told me that? How old is the part of me that feels like that right now? That's one of the best ways that I know to help people to start to get in touch with these things, is to ask yourself, when you're feeling dysregulated, or when you're feeling shamed, or when you're feeling angry, or when you're feeling humiliated, or you're feeling you can't do it, like, how old of a person are you right now? Because if it's anything less than 5 or 10 years of your current age, then that tells me there's a part of you that needs attention. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. There's a part of you that basically withdrew for safety reasons. And now you've put yourself in a situation where that part feels like he's being exposed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The one thing, well, maybe I'll just ask it directly so that you can just go into it. But when you and I have talked in the past, we've talked about different parts, like different ages at which we had these experiences that kind of held us at that age, or maybe there's a part of us that's still that age inside of us. From a Jungian perspective, we think about it as uh, the process of growing up, the sublimation of the ego, or sorry, of the libido in away from the mother into the real world. And if it's ever stopped, if that sublimation doesn't effectively happen, where the energy focuses from survival here to survival here, then you have what's called a complex. And
Mhm.
so for in our conversations in the past, you've talked about how that complex can actually take place at different ages. And I just maybe just turn it over to you, Rick, to talk a little bit about how sometimes we get stuck at a certain age, but sometimes we don't realize that there actually could be various ages in there.
Right. So there's a gentleman named John Sarno once said, the reason childhood things matter is because the unconscious has no sense of time. So when people talk about inner child work, they tend to think about maybe a toddler, or maybe a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or something like that. My experience with myself, my experience working with other people, is that there are multiple stages during our childhood up through our teens where things happen in our lives that do that fragmentation process, that split part of us off. Most of the time when I work with people, there are two ages that come up commonly. One is kind of like 5 to 6, and that tends to be the easiest one to work with. The other one is anywhere from 12 or 13 up through 15 or so. That's the tough guy. That's the one that's hard to get to. That's the one where a lot of men feel shame. That's the one where a lot of men started not liking themselves. And so I think it has a lot to do, particularly in that case. I mean, that threshold, crossing that threshold from childhood to adulthood takes several years. And it's really weird, and it's really stressful. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, the the individual does not have good guidance or a good support system to do it. So they're just trying to do it on their own. So I made a lot of decisions about myself and about the world and my place in the world and people. and all sorts of things when I was about 14 or 15 years old. Boy, is it hard for me to get myself off those things because they were made under duress. And also because that was the first time in my life that I felt like I was actually a distinct individual. Um, and I'm a little bit committed, you know, to that time in my life and the person I was then, because that was the first time I felt like, hey, I actually exist outside this family. I actually could have my own thoughts and feelings. So I think some of it is age related, and I think some of it is related to, for example, if a little boy is 8 years old and his parents get divorced, and it's a really like horrible situation, even if it's not, that can be enough. That can be more than sufficient trauma for an 8-year-old boy to basically split part of himself off and just hold on to the parts that help him the most to get through it.
Yeah, if he doesn't have the everybody's going to have difficult experiences, but if a little boy of that age doesn't have the right kind of balanced, healthy environment around him that allows him to process his emotions, he's going to that emotion, that unprocessed emotion is going to be that thing that splits him the way that you're saying.
Yeah, and that's what, if you're familiar with a guy named Tim Fletcher, who does a lot of work with complex trauma, that's his definition of trauma is unprocessed pain, unprocessed wounding. If you get, as you said, like everybody's got stuff to deal with. If you're in a family system or a social system or whatever as a child, and you have a painful experience, and you have the support and the knowledgeable, caring people around you, even if it's just one person, to help you work through it and make sense of it, that doesn't have to turn into trauma. But if you have the same experience and you have to try to deal with it on your own as an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old or a 13-year-old, you're probably going to have some trauma because trauma is the unprocessed, unhealed pain and damage that is a normal part of life that doesn't get resolved.
Yeah, I guess trauma, that unresolved trauma is the wound that you carry forward. It's the wound that it's where the work lies. You need to go back and fix it. So kind of circling all the way back to the beginning
I want to say
story.
one other thing,
Oh
Josh.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, yeah,
one
go
other
ahead.
thing. It just occurred to me, like the other thing about that unprocessed trauma is like that's where the undiscovered parts of you live. So it's not just a painful, awful thing that you have to deal with. It's like it's an opportunity for you to actually retrieve that part that got frozen or hidden or submerged during that experience, whatever it was.
Right. Yeah. In Jungian psychology, we would say that those are the things that have been repressed to the shadow or hidden in the
Hmm.
shadow.
Yeah.
Just another way of saying that it's a part of us that is we're unable to see it, feel it. It's just distant from us because another part of us is actively hiding it from us, which is the survival mechanism. Um, okay, so the story, we have these personal stories. We develop this sense of ourselves, but when we experience that trauma, that's like the wound that we carry forward. And there are a number of these wounds that have been specifically identified. And I know, Rick, you talk a lot about the mother wound, and there's also, obviously the father wound. But it seems like the mother wound is something that you've focused on lately. Do you want to explain to us exactly the way that you think of the mother wound, and then also, what its effects are?
So I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to read my definition because I want to make sure that I'm consistent and because there are all sorts of people out there talking about this issue and they all have their own definitions. So I'm going to share what mine is. A mother wound may be thought of as an injury to the psyche of a child resulting from significant dysfunction or disruption in relationship with the mother. In some cases, it is the result of a mother's absence or unavailability due to death, adoption, or other circumstances that dramatically separate the child from the mother. But more typically, a mother wound is a complex of injuries to the child's psyche received over many years, often as a result of the mother acting consciously or not out of her own woundedness. One of the most severe kinds of psychic wounding occurs when the child's primary function in the relationship is to be used by the mother to meet her own narcissistic needs. So there's kind of like a subset and a superset. It's like the superset is, okay, your mother was not good enough for whatever reason, maybe not through her own fault, not her own doing, due to circumstances. and you didn't get your needs met because there was some sort of severance in the connection between the two of you. It wasn't consistent, or it wasn't sufficient, or she was available for physical needs, not emotional needs, and all that kind of stuff. And then the subset inside it is the narcissistic mother wound, which tends to be more severe, and tends to go deeper and have more elements that need to be investigated and resolved.
Do you have more to say about the narcissistic side of it, or like what how I guess how that manifests, or how it differs from the other version?
It differs in this one significant way that it differs is just that by definition, somebody who's highly narcissistic is highly self-centered. So in order for a narcissistic mother to tend to the full set of needs of her son, she has to make it worth her while somehow to do that. Otherwise, why is it worth her time? So a narcissistic mother tends to convert the son into an appendage of herself, rather than being able to see him as a separate individual, and also seeing him as a separate individual whose needs are valid. It's difficult, if not impossible, for highly narcissistic people to see other people's needs as valid and appreciate and respect them and even have a desire to meet them. When you're talking about the relationship between a parent and a child, and you've got that kind of dynamic going on, you've got a child who's just being injured and traumatized all the time.
The way that at least I've seen it is that whether the mother is aware of herself or not, usually not, usually unconscious, the situation is such that the most important thing is always the emotional status of the mother. And
Yes.
so her relationship with each of the children, as you're saying, they become an appendage of her. In a sense, what she's doing is she's giving each of them a label, or each of them a story to fulfill based on
Mhm.
how she can get them to respond to her. And
Yes.
so in situations where somebody is having an emotional difficulty, that emotional difficulty then becomes an emotional difficulty for the mother. And so she'll attack that emotion in the child in whatever way she needs, whether it's name calling, distancing herself, uh, whatever it may be. And so you end up with this situation where the entire environment is all about managing the emotions of one person at the center of it.
Agreed. And the other part of it is it's very hard to get away because a narcissistic mother does not want her children to individuate. They are supposed to remain enmeshed with her so that they are available to meet her needs. And oftentimes they are expected to just somehow intuit her needs. And in a lot of cases for, the men I work with, as boys, they knew that it was their job to anticipate what their mother's needs were, and to do their best to meet them, because that was the best way to stay out of trouble and get some of their own needs met.
In Freudian psychology, Freud likes to say that everybody in our modern day has what's called an Oedipus complex. And I think that the way that, at least the way that I interpret it, Oedipus being the Greek myth about the boy who was sent away as a baby and came back and eventually made love to his mother. The way that I interpret it is what you're describing there is that the mother enmeshes the child. They don't want them to individuate. In fact, what they want is to create an infant. So they want to infantilize the
Mhm.
child. And so the child always has this connection with the mother. And then even for an adult who breaks free, leaves the home and is able to go have a house of their own, what happens then, or what may happen then, is that role of constantly anticipating the needs of the mother transfers then to the partner.
Yeah,
And so that's the trap that men fall into with their spouse, is that they're doing the same thing, constantly trying to anticipate, as if the emotions of somebody else are their own responsibility.
yeah, I agree. And a lot of these men wind up getting highly resentful because, number one, their needs are, if they're part of the equation at all, they're pretty far down the list. And it's an impossible task. You can't possibly anticipate somebody else's emotional states in every case and manage them to your satisfaction or theirs. And it's just, these guys, they feel like they're just, what's that guy, Sisyphus, just pushing the boulder up the hill, you know? It's almost at the top and then it comes back down again. It's just like after, they go through this for years and they start to hate themselves. And one of the things I recommend to clients is this book, No More Mr. Nice Guy. If you ever encountered that book before. And one of the points he made in there that I absolutely hated when I read it, because I saw it in myself, is that, you know, guys who think of themselves as nice guys are often highly manipulative, because that's what they learned as children with their mothers in their family system. It's like, if I'm going to get my needs met, I can't ask directly. I can't assert myself. I have to do all the chores. I have to put all the laundry away and then hope that mom's going to notice and give me a hug or make me my favorite food or something like that. And so that's how they go into adulthood. And then it's just like, look, I'm doing everything. Why am I not getting what I want?
Yeah, nice guy syndrome is something I struggled with for a long time. I had to figure that out. Because you're raised thinking that you're supposed to be nice, but really there's a big difference between being nice and being kind. And usually when you're being nice, you're not being your authentic self. I think that might be the manipulative part, is you're not being authentic because really all you're trying to do is control the emotion of the other person.
Yeah. And it's not malicious. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It's a maladaptive behavior. And it goes
Right.
back to, what's the story behind it? The story behind it is, I'm not allowed to say what I need directly. Because
Right.
if I do, I'm going to get in trouble. I'll be bullied. I'll be shamed. I'll be laughed at. I'll be rejected. I'll be abandoned. Um, so the right way to do it is to prove my value and then wait for my reward.
And usually in that case, you end up waiting forever. That's the Sisyphus situation.
Right, right.
Right.
Right. A
Would you?
lot of those guys they push that boulder up that hill, 100,000 times. And at a certain point, it does get old. And fortunately, some guys are sharp enough to realize that, like, I'm the one that's deciding to push this boulder up this hill over and over again. No one's making me do this. Why am I doing this? And that's where you start to get into the story of that. What happened before you started pushing the boulder up the hill, right? What put you in that situation and made you believe that that was the only way?
Do you mind just sharing us really quickly, once you've identified kind of that wound, say it's the mother wound, and that's what you want to focus on, and how then do you go from that to reconnecting with yourself? What's kind of that process, or what's that journey that you have to walk down?
Well, a big part of it is to actually begin to come face to face with the mother that you actually have. And I'm talking about not only the mother on the outside, your physical mother, and in some cases she may have passed on. Your mother on the outside, depending upon your situation, like if your mother lives in the house next door, then your outside physical mother is going to be a big problem potentially. But if you're across the country, like I did when I was 19, primarily the mother that many of us are dealing with are the internalized version of our mother, that model that we built internally that represents who we believe that she is and who we believe she should be. And that's where a lot of the problems come up. Uh, if you're, I don't know, I'll just throw myself as an example. If you're 55 years old and you're still wishing for the mother that you always wanted and never had, and then interacting with your actual real world mother and getting mad at her and getting upset and having a shitty, experience for 3 days after you talk to her, then what I learned is I wasn't willing to accept her the way that she was. And that wasn't just a decision on my part. I had to go through a pretty deep, pretty serious grieving process to get to that point where I could actually say, I'm never going to have the mother I wanted. And it didn't just cause me to resist. It didn't just cause me to say no. It didn't just cause me to not want to feel what it meant if that was true. Um, and so I think I guess maybe the shorter answer is to begin to get honest with yourself about how you feel when you think about acting with your mother, interacting with your mother, when you are interacting with your mother, and after you interact with her. What's that like for you? That's a good place to start.
Yeah, when I went through this for myself, when I asked those questions, it all came down to energy for me. And you're saying, how do you feel before and after? And for me, it's like, how long does it take after to recover your energy
I
to where
agree.
you're back to where you were?
Yep. Yep. I went through the same thing with my father as well, earlier in life. It's just like, wow, man, I'm useless for 3 days. If I spend 1 hour with this guy, I'm useless for 3 freaking days.
Yep.
It's like, that's a very high cost that I don't think I want to pay anymore.
So once you figure out the story, it's really it's like reframing everything from the story to reality, just accepting the way things are. And it whether it sounds easy or difficult, it's not something that happens overnight, and then it's like a gradual process over
Mhm.
time.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I had to do quite a bit of work over several years to even get to the point where I could understand and accept that my mother was narcissistic. I was just like, that just can't be true. It can't be true. And one of the reasons I thought it couldn't be true is because she was always telling me how good she was. And I believed her. That was the story, right? The story that I thought was my set of beliefs about her was actually the story that she repeatedly conditioned into me,
Right.
which was at odds with her behavior, which caused a lot of cognitive dissonance, which caused me a lot of distress. She wasn't behaving like the person she told me she was.
Right.
And even when she wasn't behaving like the person she told me she was telling me what kind of person she was, which was completely out of sync with what she was doing.
One way that I think about this whole conversation of like of realizing the source of your dissociation from self and then working back to it is, I mean, for one thing, just uh in the world we live in, it's a lot of the narrative is that men aren't supposed to have emotions, that men are supposed to bottle them up, that they're supposed to be tough, that they're supposed to be able to move on. And so there's a lot of reason I think that men avoid this topic in general. But to take it from a completely other perspective, we as humans, I mean, we're part of the mammalian kingdom. We're mammals, right? And what's unique about mammals is that there's no mammal born that does not need its mother at some period for some period to keep it alive. So from the very beginning, the mother is literally an extension of self, and the mother and the father or the family as a unit is the environment in which we live in. And so if your mother is saying she's so great, but then she doesn't act great, and then there's a dissonance, what ends up happening inside the child is you start to feel unsafe. You start to feel as if something in the environment is dangerous.
Mhm.
And from a child's perspective, I don't think any of this happens on a conscious level. This is all going on unconsciously. But from a
Right.
child's perspective, it's much less scary to blame themselves for the situation being bad than to blame their parents or their family for the situation being bad. Because if their parents or their family are dangerous, then they are inherently in an unsafe situation. And no
Yes.
child cognitively wants to deal with that or is able to deal with it. And so the fault always gets turned inward, and the child always wonders, what's wrong with me? Why am I unlovable? And that's like the deep kind of mother wound or father wound story, I think, that like has to get worked out. Is And what you're saying is you have to get to the point where you acknowledge that, oh, this isn't me, this is the story and reality not matching up.
Right. Right. And as a child, a couple of things. One is if you take the responsibility for your inadequate family system, inadequate parents as a child, at least that way you feel like, well, maybe there's something I can do about this, right? It saves you from the ultimate sort of distress is feeling powerless and unsafe at the same time. It's like, well, I feel unsafe, but maybe there's something I can do about this. And so it does and again, we're back to like, where do these stories come from? Where do these beliefs come from? You know, a lot of this is it's survival strategies. Where children are actually quite ingenious that they can sort of like get through this stuff and create these narratives and, you know, a whole belief system that enables them to survive in situations where maybe they shouldn't, because they're not getting their needs met, and yet they get through it somehow. And they're just these like ingenious little heroes. But the problem is you get to be a certain age and it's not helping anymore because you're not operating in that reality anymore. You're operating in a whole, that was a great set of strategies and beliefs and a story in that reality at that age with the limited capacities that you have cognitively and psychologically as a child. When you're 30 years old or you're 40 years old and you're still operating in the world like that, you're going to run into some problems.
Yeah, and then it's time to do something about it, I guess. Um, well, Rick, we've been going for well over 35 minutes now, so I think as planned, I think maybe we should just open it up and if anybody has questions or if there was a topic that came up that you would like to dive into, this at this point I think is meant to just be open dialogue. So questions, if you want to add, you know, does anybody have a question? Anything they want to start with?
Or if you just want to talk about some of your own experience in terms of how some of the things we talked about might have played out or some insights that you've had.
I was identifying with the coming to terms with and accepting the mother, the real mother that I have versus the one I wish I had. And I remember the first time I was with a therapist when the topic of mother, and he, I don't remember the exact remark, but I remember getting very angry at him because he pointed out something that I didn't like hearing from him about my mother. So that defense was there,
Yeah.
of the fantasy mom. And that was probably one of the first times in my life I can remember when that little crack in that wall was opened up. And then over time, that began to unfold and to a point where I was able later in life to confront my mother about some things, express some anger with her about some things that I felt I needed to share with her. And fortunately for me, she, was receptive to that. It wasn't a negative experience, and she didn't get defensive or some way try to shift the blame for it. Um, but it was a process over time and years, and in part, me coming to terms and doing that grief work and dealing with my own anger, and then getting the courage up to even bring that anger and discuss that with my mother was challenging. But in the end, on the back end of all that, I had a very richer and more real relationship with my mom towards the end of her life. At least the last 5 to 10 years, it was, I got to experience her in a whole different way, which was much more satisfying and rewarding and enjoyable and just, I think, healthy.
So it sounds like you reached a point where you could allow her to be who she really was.
Yes,
Yeah. And then you could love her in a more authentic way.
yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And even laugh about stuff.
I got you. I know it. I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. I got to that point. I got to the point too where my mother would say things on the phone that 5 years prior to that it would have sent me into a state of enragement that lasted for 4 days. And I get off the phone after I'd done the work and I just laughed. It's like, yeah, that's my mom, like, and it wasn't false. It was just because I didn't, one of the things I realized is I don't, to me, it's just not ethical for me to demand that somebody be the person I want them to be. You
Mm.
know, I don't want anybody doing that to me. And as angry as I was at her for not seeing me and letting me be who I was, after I'd done all that work, or in the process of doing that work, I realized like, damn, I'm kind of doing the same thing to her.
Something else that I remember now is I I got to a point where how I cultivated compassion for her was I would take her to dinner, we'd go to dinner, and I'd get curious about her story.
Yeah.
You know, what was her childhood like? What was, her life experience like? And I got insight into some of her experience, some of her hurts and wounds. And that gave me more compassion for her and insight into maybe what was going on inside of her and why it was coming out the way it was.
But you had to let go of who you wanted her to be to get to that point, right?
Yeah, with trying to stay curious and compassionate with her and open to hearing her story without um, wanting it to, I don't know, make me feel better about what I experienced, I guess, or
Good. Well put. And also without feeling like you had to do anything about it,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing. And there's actually a couple of things that you said that really stood out to me. Obviously one, just getting to see her story, getting to see your mother's story, and then it's so funny how we can go back and for so long be angry about our own story and how other people affected it. But in reality, everybody's doing the same thing. Every generation is coming up in an environment and trying to survive in that environment. And a lot of the adaptive qualities that existed in the past, like they become maladaptive. And if we can accept it about ourselves, like obviously you have to be able to accept it about other people, or you're just not being fair. Like Rick was saying you're just doing the same thing to other people if you can't accept it. But then the other thing you mentioned was after having been able to confront your mom and working through some things with her, and that's great that she was so willing to talk to you about that. That's a really great response. You get this experience of you have to work through a difficulty, and in a lot of the families, I think in a lot of families where these kind of mother wounds, father wounds manifest themselves, these are environments where people aren't working through things. And
Yeah.
so if you think about, well, if I think about my childhood, if anybody ever got angry, if there was a shouting match, if there was anything said, there was never any kind of like coming back together and reconciling and healing and repairing. And so the way I always saw it was that in a sense, it's a version of maintaining harmony where everybody is just not fighting. But because everybody, because you never apologize and kind of bring your stories back together, because you never say things like, I'm sorry I said that, what I meant was this, or I'm
Right.
sorry I did that, I shouldn't have done that, I didn't realize it, just apologizing and saying, hey, I'm sorry I did this. I did not intend to hurt you. That brings our stories back together where we're like on the same page again.
Mhm.
But in families where you don't do that, everybody's always on different pages about everything.
Mhm.
And so there's this sense of harmony, but really it's a fake harmony. And like Lonnie, what you were saying is once you work through things with people, you get to an actual harmony. And it's so much more, like you said, the words you said was more rich and more real. And that's exactly right. It takes real work to get there. But it's worth it because it's a completely different type of harmony and it's so much more pleasant.
Yeah, it's well observed, Josh. One of the things I noticed as you were talking, part of the one of the story elements in my family was nobody ever said I'm sorry, because if you said you were sorry, that meant you were wrong and it was all your fault. And so nobody wanted to do that. So therefore, no one ever said they were sorry for anything.
That's one of those things that when I was young, it was just so natural. It just seemed like this is how things are handled. This is the way things go. And so I never had these experiences with my own parents where, we were angry and then they would come and sit down. I think of them like the Full House or kind of like the family sitcom type moments where the parents hug the child and they say, I love you, and everybody's happy again. And I just remember watching those shows and just thinking, this is so crazy. This is so crazy. But as an adult now, having gone through a lot of this, figuring some of it out, I wouldn't say all of it, but and then being a father myself, being on the flip side and having that experience of going to your child and apologizing, accepting responsibility and saying, I'm sorry, is, oh my God, it's such an amazing experience because the children always react. If you're sincere and you say, hey, I'm sorry, children will forgive you, and they react in a way where they instantly feel more connected to you. And in a way that's not, it doesn't feel manipulative. It feels like, hey, I was trying to be genuine, and now the relationship is more genuine. And that's something that's definitely worth learning, whether it's
And that's
children or any relationship, I would say.
that's a pattern interrupt for trauma, right? Doing what you just said, that interrupts the you don't wind up with, the child shouldn't want, hopefully it doesn't wind up with trauma after that. Whereas if you raised your voice at a sensitive moment or something like that, and you don't address it, well, then the child's going to carry that and incorporate that as another story element, and you just completely cut that pathway off.
One of the redemptive components of this work is now I relate to my children differently. They have not passing that generational pattern on. And, I'm creating a different experience for them. Not perfect, but definitely bending the arc in a different direction, which again makes the relationships more rich and rewarding and intimate and real. And I, as a dad, apologize to them and ask for forgiveness from them, and am real about I take the initiative to tell them my story, to share those insights so they're not, in the dark
Yeah. And
about.
as Josh said, that keeps you all in the same story.
Hmm.
Instead of your kids splitting off into their own stories where you're just like a side character who shows up and causes trouble. Tim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, yeah. I just thought I'd share a couple things. Maybe everybody or somebody can relate to this, but with um, dealing with the mother wound, discover that with the help of Rick, and I can't thank you enough, Rick, for everything you've kind of helped me with, and I've had to really take a real um, deep dive into myself because I'm almost 60 years old. I've had 2 failed marriages. I do have 3 great kids I have good relationships with. Thank God for that. But I keep repeating the same pattern, or I did keep repeating the same pattern, and realizing that basically, the core of it is dealing with some issues that were, like plates spinning around in your head, and I think some key issues for me was definitely shame, childhood shame, betrayal, and dealing with a parent, a mother that had just incredibly unreal, expectations that will never be met, never good enough. And the classic, and I mean, it's the word of the century is narcissism, right? But I don't know other way to describe it. But the classic things like triangulation, gaslighting, projection, those were all key things that were part of my childhood and have been part of my life with my relationships with girlfriends and wives. So it's, and I know there's a lot of guys that probably go through this, and to have the resources now to deal with it, because I was really in a pretty bad place a year ago, just health wise, emotionally, coming out of with a very toxic person that really exposed traits that helped me facilitate getting with Rick, because I was a real loss of myself, my goals for my life, who were my friends, why I chose the friends I did, Um, and it's been a real process of sorting some things out and having to let people go that weren't serving me, but I was serving them. And it's you know it's a work in progress, but you know, it does come from the mother wound. And you know, it's like one of these things where you just want to say, what the hell's wrong with you? You know, why did you do this? Why, you know, even if you were even to say things, you know, components or behaviors, um, when you're that type of person, you would never be able to take a deep dive into yourself because you won't see your faults. And I know, and that's what the same with my partners I chose too. And it's been kind of like, go find somebody that's about as difficult and broken as your mother, and then try to fix them as a wife. And that's a pattern, and but it's no longer a pattern. So, but it's painful, and I'm sure there's a lot of guys that go through that. And yeah, just, you know, expressing what your needs are that you couldn't. Your needs really weren't, your basic needs were there, but emotional, no. There was none of that. It was, you know, we don't talk about those things. You don't cry. You go sit in your room. You don't sound so, I don't know, you know, things you're not supposed to really feel about, but when it shapes you as an adult, as a person, and you don't realize it, but when you finally do, you're like, oh man, so this is why this is that. And you know, there's some great resources, and Rick has been instrumental with, you know, getting me with a lot of work with Tim Fletcher, understanding some components that he has, and you know, just different books and articles and activities to kind of bring some things out. So I guess I've probably done enough talking, but yeah, just if anybody else is out there kind of that's a similar thing with anybody, you know, you're not alone. So
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing, Tim. I appreciate that. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in there. I would just maybe want to riff on one of the things you said about, I guess maybe you were imagining, you know, being able to speak to your mother, or maybe it's just the mother in your head or something, but you're saying like, I would love to be able to talk to you about these things. And one of the challenges is that if somebody hasn't if somebody hasn't, you know, if somebody bought into their story from day one, they're converted to their story and they never let it go, they never changed. They didn't have the dissonance that maybe we had with our story, and so they just kept it. One of the challenges with a person like that is that they've never looked inward, they've never questioned themselves, and they've never worked on like a vocabulary related to growth. And so just to broach the conversation of, hey, can we talk about this? Um, there's as sad as it may be, as hard as it may be to accept as an emotion, there is for some of us the reality that they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the understanding, they don't have the willingness. They just have a story, and they're like gonna live that. And so and then for us to come from a world where that's the case, obviously we're going to fall into those patterns you're talking about. And then the thing that we can do, right, the thing that we can control is try to figure those things out, try to have that vocabulary, how to have that curiosity about ourselves, no matter how scary. um, from a Jungian perspective, it's often the thing that you fear the most, that's where your opportunity for growth is. And so for a lot of us, this is it.
yeah, I think shame is probably the worst thing. it goes so deep and things just pile on top of it. And I think people, some do it purposely. Some are very manipulative. Others are just ignorant. And I don't like to be around either one of them. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's yeah, that's how I feel sometimes too, because yeah, I don't think that the answer shouldn't the first answer shouldn't be I'm gonna walk away. But there are people who they are unconscious enough, which I guess you could say they're ignorant enough, like they're unconscious enough or ignorant enough, or they're doing it on purpose. And if it's egregious, I think in both cases, I've had to walk away.
in the past, like with that, I think at least based in the relationship, you run into the passive aggressive communication with the shame. And it's just until you don't realize it until you realize it. And you're like, it's like, this is such a load of shit. I'm like, yeah, it's like, that's not good. Not one more second, So, but yeah,
Yeah.
too bad it's taken so long to do this, but at least it's better late than never. So, yeah.
Yeah, I actually, I did no contact with my mother, but I didn't do it. It wasn't even a decision I made. I didn't do it all at once. It became so distressing and so damaging and unproductive for me to have phone calls with her that one by one, I just stopped calling her on holidays. Like one year it was Easter, the next year it was Mother's Day. And finally I got to the point where it's just like, well, I just think I'm just not going to communicate with her for a while. And in my case, that was the only way that I could separate from her. I could not separate from her properly as long as I was in communication with her because the enmeshment was so strong. And my automatic behaviors were so entrenched that I had to get distance from her in terms of contact because otherwise I never would have been able to get myself free.
Yeah. Putting up boundaries. That's a tough one too.
Tim, do you feel like for you, what is the more significant challenge? Is it shame or is it fear?
Maybe a little, maybe more shame, but there's always the fear component, you're always, you know, kind of wondering sometimes, like, I think as you grow, you become less fearful because you're not sometimes gaslighting yourself, you know.
Well said, yeah.
And that's been, I think, the case with me is like, I don't say, oh my God, how did that conversation go? Could I have done that better? Was I too harsh, or was I not assertive enough, or did I talk too much, or did I not say enough? Um, but it's kind of one of those things. You just kind of, I guess, when you're more confident and comfortable with yourself again after going through some stuff, then yeah, you're just kind of like, whatever, you take it or you leave it.
Would you say though that the source of shame is story? Because at some point the shame must be arising due to a perceived lack of value, and that itself would would likely be coming from a story now.
Yeah, yeah, there's always that. It's
There's there's a guy, I can't remember his last name, but his first name is Peter, and he wrote a book on what he calls complex PTSD.
Pete
Talking about
Walker.
Pete Walker.
Yeah, Pete Walker. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it sounds like you guys are familiar, but he's got this in the book, he's got this idea that really helped me. Um, and a little bit of it was around shame, but more of it was just around just the negative, kind of the heavy negativity of like carrying it. And the part from Peter Walker that was interesting to me was he's got this idea of an inner critic and an outer critic. And essentially, the easy way to think of it is like when you talk about yourself in your head in a negative way, that's your inner critic. And for me, it became extremely helpful to connect that with the idea of the mother wound, because I could see that all the things I was saying to myself in my head, I was saying it to myself in the same way that my mother would have said it, either about me or about somebody else. And then the other side of that is there's this thing called the outer critic, which is basically anytime you're talking about somebody else or something else in your head in a negative way. So basically, if you're judging yourself, if you're casting shame on yourself, that's your inner critic. And if you are doing it to the outside world, that's your outer critic. And the thing that was critical was to recognize that that's not my voice. It's not my voice. And I don't even want to talk in such a negative way. I don't enjoy it. And it wears me out in the same way that spending time with my family wears me out. And yeah, I was at some point, I just had to acknowledge that this critic, whether it was the inner or the outer, this critic believed things that I no longer believed. And it was saying things that weren't helpful to me. And it's not like I don't still struggle with it, but once I identified that, like, hey, this isn't, I could just ask the critic, is this helpful? And that question usually shuts the critic down pretty quickly.
It's pretty good, actually.
Well, in the same way I had to separate from my mother, that separation exercise with the inner critic occurred. And in the same way I got compassion from my mother and her story, I got compassion from my inner critic and its story. Where did it pick up its beliefs, and what's it's afraid of? What's the fear if it would stop criticizing? What is the fear would happen? And so begin to relate with that part instead of trying to fight with it, cut it off. That only seemed to increase its intensity.
This is a conversation that could just be all its own conversation. Because for me, this whole inner critic thing has just been really fascinating for me. Because Pete Walker talks about different ways to address it. And I think for a lot of people in the beginning, it really is necessary to be forceful and tell it to go away, tell it to shut up. You're wrong, that's false. I've reached the point with mine where it comes up most frequently with me when because I've always been challenged around physical movement and stuff like that. I got traumatized around that stuff because I was slow as a kid. And so if I go to work out and if I'm having kind of a bad day already, here it comes. You're going to get hurt. That's from my mom. You're stupid. You're too slow. Why don't you understand it yet? Everybody can see that you don't know what you're doing. That's from my dad, my coaches, and other kids. And I'm at the point now where I just go, I hear you. Like, I hear you, message received, and I just keep doing what I'm doing. And then it just recedes. But I couldn't get there. That's not how I couldn't have started like that. I had to take the more assertive, forceful, you're wrong, that's a lie, But I like what Josh said. Like, what did you say? Is this helpful?
Yeah, yeah. And I think I was probably doing the same thing at the beginning where I was like trying to argue or I was getting mad back at my internal critic. But when I could just the same as if you're meditating and you just try to sit and feel and accept it. And if you get like, in meditation, you try to talk to yourself gently. So once I was able to talk to myself gently and just say, is this helpful? Is this really helpful? Is it really?
That's true. I like that. I like that. Because a lot of people come to, a lot of people, clients I work with, people I work with, when they start to get introduced to this concept, their first question is, how do I make it go away? It's like, you can't make it go away. It's part of you. It's a maladapted, damaged, often very immature part of you. And I think there's an aspect to the inner critic that is really a child who's struggling, who actually thinks he has a job to do to try to keep you safe. Even though like I said, part of mine is you better stop exercising, you're going to get hurt. And that was internalized from my mom, but I don't hear it in my mom's voice, and it's different for different people. for some people, the whole inner critic experience is really just about how they feel. It's more of a felt experience, well, rather than verbal type thing, message. Some people, their inner critic or their whole inner critic experience is just suddenly feeling horribly ashamed of themselves. And there isn't necessarily any message associated with it at all.
I was definitely someone who had a lot of shame. And over the years, I I've learned to basically not shut down, but the inner critic was kind of like quiet nowadays. Um, and I think what really helped me with my own shame was treating myself as if I was my own child or my little boy. And I got that little boy idea from Dr. Corey Wayne, Hold On to Your Nuts. And that was when I was going through like my first season of coaching. Um, so the idea of like the little boy, like, you know, he's having a tantrum when you didn't get what he wants, and sort of as a myself as an adult have to like father myself in a way or parent myself. And eventually, like over time, my shame just kind of it's less it's severely less nowadays, just by purely just seeing myself as, hey, like you went through really crappy childhood, you know, little dude, like, and mom was pretty rough, and everything about you're doing pretty good, and like so that kind of like self-talk, but to you as like a little boy, um, and yeah, it's been quite a powerful tool for me just on that, and since I've been doing some work with Rick, and also I'm getting a therapy as well from a woman. It's been kind of like, for me, it's been really powerful. So like Rick is sort of like the male role model kind of dude, and I have my therapist who's like a female, so like a feminine kind of perspective. It's really been helping me grow, and yeah, yeah, definitely like the treating myself as a little boy, and it really helps the inner critic to be quiet. And I also was just thinking about like the idea of like, expecting my mom to be a certain way, or to be the mom I want to be, or want her to be. I've noticed myself like when I interact with my mom, it's I have to minimize interaction with her now because I still live at home. Um, and it's quite difficult to detach. And I was just thinking to myself, like, if I were to let go of like the idea of her being who I want her to be, I think what would really help is for me to be not in the same environment. Um, yeah, because yeah, especially when I'm around her, I can always feel her judgment. Always feel that judgment.
Mhm.
Every time like I walk in the kitchen, like want to make some food, I'm always feeling her watching me. uh, yeah, but, I'll get there. Working on it.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I mean, that's really good stuff too. The idea of self-parenting. In a way, self-parenting is just talking back to yourself gently, kind of gentle encouragements. It's so strange because like you gave out the example of like a child throwing a tantrum. And eh, growing up, we probably all had this experience of either we threw a tantrum or some other kid threw a tantrum, and we watched an adult respond by throwing another tantrum
Yeah.
back at the child.
Yeah.
And now as an adult, just wanting to live in a world where there's like love, gentleness, understanding. You can't, it's really hard to wrap your head around like yelling at a young child for having a tantrum. And so if you think about the way you would respond to them, the best way to respond is to just relax. Just like relax, get down to their level. Don't stand over them. Get down there and just let them go through it, and then just talk gently to them. Don't like you wouldn't respond harshly, you wouldn't respond angrily, because they're a kid. You can just see them as a kid, and they're just being a kid. And so being that parent for yourself, taking over, like stepping in where the critic is being too strong and saying like, no, like let's not make him feel bad. Like let's comfort that inner child. Let's go down to his level. It's really good practice. It's really good practice, like in a meditative state where you're just sitting there kind of doing it intentionally. It's really good practice writing things down, like writing letters to your inner child or younger self at some point and just saying, hey, this is how I would have handled it if I was an adult in that situation and you needed me. Um,
Important that I do with people is get that part of yourself to write a letter back to you, right? So like that's part of to gotta wrap back about an hour. One of the ways that you can start to improve and develop and evolve your relationship with yourself is find out what those younger parts want you to know. And so this is something I do with just about everybody is like, whatever age we identify, whether it's a 8-year-old or a 13-year-old, it's like, do a letter exchange with that part of yourself. As you as the adult, what I like to do first is have the person write a letter to his adult self as the 8-year-old or the 13-year-old and just say whatever he wants and ask whatever he wants. And then as the adult respond, because I think one of the sort of, what can I say? One of the things I think is maybe not sufficiently emphasized in the inner child work that I've experienced and seen is like it tends to be one direction. It tends to be from the adult to the child communication. And I think for a lot of us, our inner child is just like, hey, so great. So another adult's trying to tell me how it is, you know? And that's one of the things I like about let's start with the younger self first and let him express himself and tell you what it is that is on his mind or what he needs or what he wants or who he's upset with or whatever. And the other way I like to do it is with having people draw pictures, draw a picture of what it was like when you were 8 years old and you came home crying because a bully punched you in the face and your dad told you to suck it up. You know, people do some really surprising work that's really potent and really profound. And it's another way to gather information from a younger part of yourself that sort of operates in a different mode than you do.
Yeah, what I heard you say that I kind of did resonate with was your intentionality about doing work, Rick, and with a female therapist. And I've done similar things where I've taken my inner children into these new environments with healthy people to get a corrective emotional experience. So they've got a new experience now with that's healthier, and then it can be heard, that trauma can be processed, and then that part um, unburdened or experiencing some healing. But um, I think the title of this is Pathways to Healing. That's a practical one. Is now as an adult, I get to choose who I put myself in relationship with for the most part. And I can go out and seek those healthy relationships and resources and get some new experiences that kind of help begin to shape that inner dialogue and transform those inner belief systems. So now my experience of the world and life and others is also transformed. And I'm having a new experience and a new of life itself because of some of this work that's been done.
Yeah, 100%. Like, especially like with my therapist, because I had no experience of like what is healthy, right? Um, so I had to like seek out for it, and so
Mm.
like doing the work with Rick, like him just one example, like when him and I like were doing a session, um, he read out my letter to my letter to my mother, and sort of like for Rick to, for someone, not just Rick, but for someone basically advocate for me, advocate for me when no one else was around, like when I was a child, like that was very like huge because I never had that before.
Yeah.
Even though I have like brothers, like older brothers, just like have Rick, someone like for the first time, just stand up, like, hey, you did this to Darren, or you know, um, yeah, that was pretty powerful for me. So I'm choking up a little bit, so I'm containing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been pretty powerful, and just by Rick just doing that and leading in that example, I'm also learning how to advocate for me
Mhm.
because someone else did it to me. I've noticed that, experienced that. Oh, I can do it to myself, and that's something I've been working on quite recently, and also like I'm starting to learn how to stand up for myself and set boundaries, especially like with like, girl problems and stuff and all that. Yeah, but in general, like nowadays, like I'm starting to learn, I'm starting to notice things like, oh, I didn't like that, like how that person spoke to me. I'm gonna like say something, kind of,
Mm.
like just the fact to just to voice it. Yeah. So yeah, it's been pretty bloody awesome, I'll say. And yeah, adulting.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, actually feeling like an adult because even though it was difficult, you recognized what your need was and you like stepped up and you stated it out loud in a way that wasn't aggressive, that wasn't manipulative. You just said, "Hey, it's, maybe set a boundary. It's not okay for you to do that," or, "Hey, this is what I need right now." And to actually get adults, because this is the thing that I've learned is that you come from an environment that's unhealthy. And so your pattern of behavior in the world is unhealthy. And so you get all this stuff back that just feels wrong. It's like, well, why do you treat me like that? Or why do you look at me like that? Or why do people respond in this way? Why can't I get ahead here? And then as you start to peel back the layers or the stories, you start to work through these things and understand how to assert yourself, how to you start to live in a healthier way. You start to turn off the critic and you start to have a more positive view of the world. And then the world starts to feel more positive. And what I found is that the more healthy that I am, the more balanced, the more genuine that I am to myself, the more I somehow come across these other people who are also being genuine, who are also being true to themselves. And then these are like the most fun people to hang out with because everybody's just open, everybody's real. And what's beautiful about being around other people who are open and like working towards growth is that they're happy for you to be doing the same thing. And then you can end up in this world where you actually meet people who, even though they're very different from you, they may have different ideas than you, different stories, different interests, but you meet people who are just being themselves. And all they want to be around, like all they want is to be around other people who are just being themselves.
Mhm.
And there's this amazing thing where you get to be around people and it doesn't suck your energy away. In fact, it gives you a lot of energy because all of a sudden you're not working at it. You're not like, oh, what do they think? Or, oh, how do I present myself? There's no ego persona going on. Everybody's just happy that everybody's being themselves. And the energy that can fill that room is just unbelievable.
I can attest to that because when I met Josh, this is Bingo speaking, trying to figure out the video. But after I've had a session with Josh, I was awake until 4 o'clock the next morning because he gave me so much energy and things to think about. And it's what is interesting talking about the mother wound. What happens if you have a relationship when you grow up? So this is my brief story that I want to quickly share. If you grow up in an environment where your parents are actually incredibly great, and you have a mother that I cannot think of a time when she judged me, or it was just this incredible, nurturing environment throughout childhood. So a mother that was just loving and attentive. So there's what can possibly go wrong with that? You would ask yourself. But if your frame of reference is then formed that women are these magical creatures which cannot do anything wrong because you've had a mother that was just so incredible that you cannot think of a single example where she actually did something hurtful to you throughout your entire childhood, that can lead to problems because you have this view of a world where you view women as being incredibly gentle and you just trust them without setting boundaries because you didn't have to experience that with your own mother and your own environment. Even in your own, for example, the town that I grew up in, the women, just not beyond my own mother, was just so incredibly attentive and loving that your entire view of growing up was that women, regardless of who they are, will take care of you and will just act in a very compassionate way. So it's interesting to hear these. Well, let me see. How can I turn this video on? There we go. Hopefully you can see.
Yeah, there he
Good.
is.
Good. Sorry, I'm on my phone, so I've had to figure this out. But I just thought I'll give you that different perspective where you don't have negative association even today with your mother or your parents, but it can lead to different problems because your worldview was just created in a way that you didn't experience narcissism or being judged or any hurtful actions.
It's almost like you grew up on an island where there are no viruses, right? So your
I
immune
almost
system
did,
never
yes. In a
develops.
way, I
Yeah.
did. Yeah,
Yeah. And
I
then you go
did.
out into the rest of the world, you're like, well, I'm sick. What's wrong with me? Like I'm sick all the time. I don't understand why. I was always fine before.
And that's indeed what happened because if you compare, because I have four siblings, and if you compare between the two other brothers, experiencing the same thing where you have such trust relationship with women, and who each one of us married, then you realize that you have this utopian view of not understanding reality because you just were exposed to yeah, you only received the good, you didn't receive the bad side. So I think that's where growth comes in. There are positive aspects as well to understand when you don't have that relationship with your parents, that with negative effects where it's really great, then you are less prepared to deal with a different side once you enter adulthood.
Darren, are you from the other side of the world? Are you from New Zealand
I'm
or
from
Australia?
Australia.
Australia. Yeah, I thought I
Yeah.
picked it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a good friend in New Zealand, so I always I want to see if people are attached to the island.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you born
Well, you
there?
got,
Did you immigrate? Your family immigrate there, or?
I was born and raised here. My parents came here during the Vietnam War. So there's a lot of trauma in that sense.
Hmm.
Yeah. They came here on a boat, a crappy boat back in the day. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, we've been talking a lot about parental and family trauma, but like ethnic trauma, national trauma, wars, immigrations, like man, there's a lot of unprocessed emotion in the world. Does anybody else
Yeah.
have a question or some kind of rabbit hole they want to spend 10 minutes on?
One thing I'd like to say is, with going through the stuff and with different things that affect us, being able to respond to things instead of reacting to them has been a big help for me, especially when you get a little emotionally dysregulated with things and just kind of step back for a minute. And yeah, it's a big help.
How did that process start for you, Tim?
Just when you have a better understanding of yourself, I
Okay.
guess,
Okay.
and your things that affect you and how they affect you, and just realizing your value and your worth,
Mhm.
that you have that. You're like, yeah, how do I want to spend this energy?
Okay.
How do I want to apply it?
For me, it's the kind of thing where you go through little by little, you have insights. Little by little, you see maybe where you might be wrong or maybe where your pattern is unhealthy. Little by little, just kind of one thing at a time. And just choosing, like, once you're aware of it, just choosing, like, oh, I'm going to make an effort in this aspect of my life. And so, maybe it's anger, maybe it's resentment or shame or something where you know you're going to have these emotional experiences throughout your life, and in a sense choosing ahead of time how you're going to deal with it. And so not falling into a pattern, not becoming unconscious and like trying to push that emotion onto other people through your words or actions, but just choosing ahead of time to say, oh, when this comes up, like I'm gonna do my best to just sit with it, or I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna go for a walk, I'm gonna, to have a plan ahead of time. And yeah, I mean, it's part of the growth process, is that like once you identify it, then it's kind of on you to own it.
I think it's also really helpful to be able to name what you're feeling, to put words to it. It's like I'm at the point now where it's like if I can't come up with 6 to 8 different words, you know, to get more granular and specific about feeling sad, then I don't feel like I've got enough information to really understand how I do feel and why.
That's a really good point. In fact, that's something that I think about all the time, where if you live in an environment where things never get labeled, it labeled correctly, if things never get labeled correctly, then there is no chance at like solving them. They don't, the way that we work, is that things don't come into, like, these are all abstract ideas that we're trying to process. And so they don't come into reality for us until we have a name for them, until we can put a word or a label to them. And so
Mhm.
that's part of that vocabulary, is just, it's a long process of reading, listening, talking, and building a vocabulary so that you can put labels to things.
Well, I
Does that,
think part
yeah.
for me is I think that's kind of, in some ways, it follows on my previous life, being in information technology for 35 years and having to do a lot of diagnosis of problems. And like you get the client basically puts in a problem request and says, this doesn't work. It's like, okay. Can we have a conversation so I can find out a little bit more about what this is and what doesn't work means? And we can use that same sort of discovery process with ourselves when we say, well, I'm depressed right now. Well, you can actually develop that into a set of descriptors that gives you a lot more information. And when you have more information and more accurate descriptors, then you can start to get some ideas about what actually is motivating it.
Yeah, and I guess in a sense, to take it all the way back, what you start to do is craft the story intentionally through data that you run through a process of actual analysis. And so the story in your head starts to match the reality that you exist in. And that dissonance becomes so much lighter. Just everything becomes lighter.
Right. And the story becomes not just, it's daytime. It's like, okay, well, what else? And as you said, that's one of the things that we, in these sort of neglectful, traumatizing, abusive, etc. family systems, we don't get to practice that as children. If we even get to say, I feel sad, it's like a freaking miracle, you know, without even having the possibility of someone, an adult who's more emotionally developed, say, well, how do you know you're sad? What does that mean? We don't get to do that. So we just wind up with these, it's like we have like 6 blocks that we can use: anger, sad, whatever. It's like, that's it. That's all I've got.
Yeah, I actually had the first therapist that I ever worked with, she was actually really helpful for me, because my with her, our whole like process was just getting to the point where I could like recognize my emotions, what I was
Mhm.
actually feeling. And she put me through this really interesting exercise that I've used with my children as well, is when they're feeling something and they're having a hard time explaining it, to start explaining it in a way that maybe you wouldn't initially expect. You start asking questions about it, like, where is it located?
Yes.
Oh, is it it's this part of my body. Okay. And what's it like? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is
Mhm.
it sharp? Is it dull? Is it moving? Is it stationary? Is it shrinking? Is it growing? What color is it? Just very strange questions. Does it have a flavor?
Mhm.
Is it saying anything? Like, does it put a thought in your head? Just a lot
Perfect.
of these questions about identifying what it actually is. And you start to, yeah, you start to actually have words for it.
Yeah. I remember in one of the first men's groups I was in, um, the facilitator recognized that I was filled with anger, but I didn't. And we were working through one of those exercises and we got to a certain point and he said, well, if you could remove that anger from your body, how much space would it take up? I was like, it would take up the whole town, like, and that gives you an idea of the relative size of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, one of the big aha was this realization that I have this inner world. I have this rich, diverse um, inner world populated with these stories and these parts and this whole dimensions that I get the opportunity to go back and explore. Then finding the people to help me kind of begin that journey and to get in touch and give me a roadmap and maybe Sherpa kind of help me, guide me along the way till I kind of figured out how to do some of the, get my own compass and my own map and figure out how to navigate it. And it's made a huge difference in the quality of my life. Just that aha, like there's an outer world, there's also this rich inner world.
Yeah.
That it's worth turning back into and exploring. There's a lot of hidden treasures in there.
Yeah. And the map is important. The map is part of the story as well. Because if you don't even know it's there, like, and then it opens up and you're like, well, how do I map this out? Like, where is everybody? Where is everything? What do I even call these things?
Well, I think the beautiful thing about it, and a part of all this work that you do, Rick, is that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think life will always provide us with opportunities to grow, but you keep going down that path, and there's definite light at the end of the tunnel, and it feels good to have like an okay relationship with yourself and to have like healthy relationships with other people. So yeah, I appreciate like every conversation I've had with you, Rick, but I also appreciate you doing this one with us. And thanks to everybody. We had a small group, but thanks to everybody who joined, because I think that it always works out better when it's like a small group, is a little more intimate and everybody has a voice.
Yeah, thanks for setting it up, Josh, and thanks to, all you guys for showing up and taking part and being willing to share some little bits and pieces of your story with the rest of us so that we could all gain some value from the expansion of the topic.
It's a nice, pleasant surprise. Nice treat. Middle of the week.
All right.
Thanks for
Well,
joining.
yeah, thank you. Thanks for attending. And I really appreciate everybody for participating. It makes it really like really rich. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, we had a little ad hoc men's group here.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, I guess good night. Unless, Rick, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
No.
Okay.
Can't think of anything else right now. I think we
Okay.
got it.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And have a good
Nice
night.
to meet you.
Yeah,
Bye.
you too. Bye.